So let's talk about really your rise to national prominence.
Well, when I was, okay, I'll just kind of truncate it. After I worked in Miami in local news, uh, I had someone who was representing me at the time, surprisingly, and she said there was an opportunity at WRC in Washington. I think it was because her boyfriend was the news director. I mean, it's always sort of a strange set of circumstances. So I said, great, I would love to work in Washington. I never imagined living my whole life in Miami. I was from Washington, the Washington area, and I thought in Washington, local news is really national news in many cases, unless you're covering the city council or Marion Barry, that many of the stories are of national significance. So I said, great, and I ended up going to WRC in Washington and working there for a couple of years, covering everything from soup to nuts, to Capitol Hill hearings, to the Vietnam Veteran Memorial and the controversy about that, to a Grateful Dead concert in my little pink linen dress, which I looked ridiculous. But I also did a fair amount of political reporting and would run after Marion Barry and kind of like a dog with a bone, not let him get away from me. And that caught Tim Russert's eye because in Washington, WRC shares a building with the NBC News Washington Bureau, and Tim was the Washington Bureau chief. And one day he called me and said he'd like to talk to me. And I was like, really? So I went down to his office and he said, I would like to offer you a job as the deputy Pentagon correspondent for NBC News. Do you think you could do that job? And I said, yes, I really do. I think I could do that job. And he said, I've watched your reporting and I'm very impressed and I'd like to give you a shot. And that's how my career on the national stage began, all because of Tim. I really feel like I owe so much to Tim. And the other person I owe a lot to is Fred Francis, who was the Pentagon correspondent, the senior Pentagon correspondent. And he had worked in Miami and kind of was following my career a bit. And he had given me a thumbs up as well to Tim because I was going to be working for him and with him, really, and learning from him. So those two people I think I owe my whole career to. And I'm so sad that Tim's not around, not only for selfish reasons, but for our business, because he was the real heart and soul, I think, of our business, and was such a fine political reporter and such a decent person. I think that decency just leapt through the screen, and that's why I think he engendered so much respect and admiration from his viewers and colleagues.
Is there any advice or anything that he gave you that you take with you as a journalist?
You know, not really. I think he just would, was right there saying, kid, get out there, show them what you've got. I don't think there was a lot of advice he offered me specifically. This is when that journal would have really come in handy. But I think he was just very, very supportive. And they asked me to sit in on the weekend Today show, and I did with Garrett Utley. That was an incredible experience, and that was when Nelson Mandela was freed. I was sort of at the helm of that coverage with Garrett Utley. And, Tim just always looked for opportunities for me. And I think he felt like he was my Svengali in a way. And when the Today Show became interested in having me, be involved in that program and work as a newsreader or as a national correspondent, he was sort of like a proud father. So he was just behind me every step of the way.
How did you come onto the Today Show?
Elena Nachmanoff, who hires talent for NBC, came down and said, I'd like to have you try to be a newsreader. And I said, I'm just really not a very good anchor. I've tried it a few times and it's been disastrous. But she said, why don't you work on it and try to get comfortable, and then we'd love to have you come up and fill in. So at the Washington Bureau, I started working on reading the teleprompter and making sure the page in front of me matched the page on the prompter in case the prompter crapped out and I was left going humana, humana, humana. And then I went up to New York. Then I went up to New York and filled in and started being a newsreader. And I think they thought I was sort of funny because I'll never forget, I read a kicker about a skier who got lost in the mountains and ended up lighting her cache on fire, and I guess rescue crews above saw this fire. And I think I threw back to Bryant Gumbel saying, you know, with my luck, I would have just had change or something like that. It wasn't that funny, but it was just sort of funny. And I think people saw that I had a personality and could be kind of lighthearted and fun and yet deliver the news as well. And from there, they made me national correspondent, and I got to do a lot of pieces for them. And then I was the beneficiary of an awkward situation between Jane Pauley and Deborah Norville when they replaced Jane, who was much loved, with Deborah, who is incredibly talented and beautiful, but viewers felt like Jane had been pushed out and replaced by the younger trophy wife, basically. So I think having me come in after that kind of disastrous transition, it felt like it was kind of, I was more of a Jane Pauley than a Deborah Norville. I was more of a Mary Ann than a Ginger. Basically. Harkening back to my Gilligan's Island childhood.
Talk a little about that job itself. First of all, was that something that you aspired to? Did you ever think
The Today Show?
Yeah.
Holy cow, I never in a million years thought I would ever have a job like that. My goal, which I think was maybe realistic, was to be a network news correspondent, like Cassie Mackin or Bettina Gregory. I wanted to be respected by my peers. I wanted to be out there every day covering the big story or covering a story. And that's really as far as it went. Because I was such a lousy anchor, and because I was never sort of at the time helmet-headed, sort of blonde. I mean, things have changed a little for me. I don't think people in management ever really saw me as an anchor woman. I think they saw me as a scrappy street reporter and someone who was cute enough but not nearly glamorous enough to be an anchor.
Did it bother you that you were considered cute as a news person?
It did bother me, and I think it actually kept me back a little bit because I was very young looking. I kind of looked like a Campbell Soup kid. I had this round face and chubby cheeks and, you know, short and demure and, well, not demure, but short. And I think, you know, I couldn't really change that. You know, a new hairdo or dressing a certain way or wasn't going to change the basic, my basic appearance and who I was. And I think as the youngest child, I also just developed as somebody who had an outgoing personality that could easily be categorized as cute. So, you know, I kind of just dealt with it. I mean, I think that people like to categorize individuals, and they have a very hard time when someone actually is many things and not just one thing. So I knew I was plenty smart, and I knew that I was a good writer and I was creative. If I happened to have a youthful appearance, I didn't think that would necessarily negate all my other qualities. So I just kept working on my skills and thought, you know, there are worse things than being called cute.
That's a great answer. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, so how did your first day on the Today Show go?
It was funny. I was 4 months pregnant my first day as the anchor. My first day on the Today Show, I was 4 months pregnant, so I remember getting up, throwing up, putting on a red maternity dress from Pea in the Pod, and getting in there, and of course it was so exciting and terrifying. And I remember Bryant introducing me, and I said, you know, they played it over and over again with Bryant Gumbel and Catherine Couric, and he replayed it, and I said I didn't know whether I was Catherine or Katie, and I was very confused, and I told him that he should call me Katie, because I think I just wanted to be my genuine self, and I think that's really actually been my mantra through my career. You know, I think people appreciate authenticity. And I know I can smell a phony a mile away, and I can sense a phony even on the television. And so I thought I just had to be true to myself and be who I was. And when I was on the Today Show, I never pretended to know the latest sports news that Bryant was discussing. I'd say, there was a big game last night, and I never tried to be someone I wasn't. And I think that really has served me well throughout my career.
In terms of the Today Show, what did you learn from your experience
Yeah,
there?
I learned to be able to turn on a dime. I would be doing a serious interview with David Duke or Yasser Arafat or Lee Iacocca or an important politician, and then have to maybe do a segment about parenting or heart disease. I really had to become Jackie of all trades, if you will, and become adept at doing a variety of things. I also learned how important it is to have the right tone when you're approaching an interview. You can have a very contentious interview or a confrontational interview, but it's always important to have a tone of respect, and you can be persistent and you can do follow-up questions, but your tone has to be in keeping, I think, with the subject matter. Similarly, if you're interviewing someone who's experienced a great tragedy, your tone has to be appropriate there as well. And Jeff Zucker and I used to talk about that a lot, and he really helped me to find the right pitch for everything I was doing, and I think that was extraordinarily helpful. I also learned the importance on a show like that, where there's a lot of room to say things and to be spontaneous, that you have to have the split-second judgment. You have to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. You have to say, gosh, am I going to offend anyone if I say this? And yet also be able to be funny and make off-the-cuff remarks. So I think that skill was really honed for me. And I think that's something that you almost have to be born with. It's sort of this innate sense of what's appropriate and what isn't. And that's something I think that was very, very much honed during my years at the Today Show, but that I had anyway, but I just had to exercise a lot, I guess.
Talk about the move then to CBS News.
I loved doing the Today Show, and I did it for 15 years, and they were some of the happiest years of my professional life. I got to travel, I got to do really important interviews. You know, we did fun stuff, obviously. We did cooking segments and fashion and sports, but sometimes I think people forget all the important news stories I covered, whether we're talking about the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, or Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, of course, Waco. I covered so many stories of national and international significance during those 15 years on the Today Show, the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, the list goes on and on. But this opportunity at CBS News became available. And I thought, gosh, anchoring an evening newscast by myself. Women had done it. Barbara Walters had done it with Harry Reasoner. Connie Chung had done it with Dan Rather. But they had never entrusted this position to a sole female anchor. And I thought, wow, this is a real opportunity, because I know how important images are as people develop attitudes. When Bryant Gumbel invited me to be on the Today Show, or when NBC News invited me to be Bryant's co-anchor, I said, I don't want to do this job if I'm relegated to cooking segments and he does all the big interviews. because I don't think that's right. Because when Bryant came in and Jane had seniority, I thought she, quite frankly, abdicated too much to him. So I remember saying, I want a 50-50 proposition, which I think is so nervy. Here they were giving me one of the best jobs in television, and I was making demands. But I thought it was important. I had covered the Pentagon. I had worked in local news covering tough stories, and I didn't work so hard to be doing fluff. So I remember Michael Gartner, who was president of NBC News at the time, said, I can't make it 50-50, but how about 52-48? And I said, it's a deal. I'll do it. But I'm so proud of myself that I did that because, again, I knew that little girls and little boys and other people were watching this. And it was important to me as the woman on the show to be given meaty, important topics and to show I could handle them as well as Bryant could, or almost as well, because he was a really good interviewer. But that was really important to me because I think I was very, very influenced by the women's movement. I grew up and really I was on the cusp of the women's movement as I matured and during my formative years. And it really had a powerful impact on me. And I thought, I believe in equality for women, and you know, all along the way, I'm going to do what I can to make sure that I'm being treated the same way as men in my position.
Why do you think that when you went to CBS News that it was such a big deal? Why hadn't women been able to break through before?
Well, I think it was the first time. Anytime you're a first, yes, there were a lot of women in prominent positions in television news, but no single woman had had this job. So I think that in and of itself was a big deal. I think I had become, you know, fairly well known when I worked on the Today Show. You know, and the whole America's Sweetheart thing, I think in a way worked against me because I think people saw me perhaps as more of a TV personality than a TV journalist. So I think there were many reasons that it was a big deal. Could I do it? Did I have the experience? Did I have the gravitas? I think people forgot about a lot of the serious news I'd covered. And the fact that I was a woman, I was jumping ship, I was going to a whole new network, and probably the most traditional network of all three. So I think that there was a lot of attention. You know, sometimes in retrospect, I wish I had done fewer interviews, but I think it would have been written about regardless. So I thought if people are going to cover this story, I might as well get my imprimatur on it as well.
And so you're at CBS News, it's really the legacy seat for a news anchor. Did you want to make changes when you started?
Well, I really came over with the understanding that they wanted to revamp the evening news. And by that I mean they wanted to tinker with it, and not just along the edges, but you know, stylistically and content-wise. They wanted it to still be an important newscast, but maybe less formulaic, less predictable, less like the others. So I thought, well, that's really fun creatively. So we tried to do that, but I think we underestimated the risk of trying new things under the bright white spotlight of my coming here as the first woman. So as a result, I think some of the things we tried when we said, oh, cavalierly, we'll see what happens, we'll just try some things. I don't think we understood that we would be so criticized or eviscerated for playing with a format that had been around for years and years and years, and quite frankly, the audience was comfortable with, at least an older audience that wanted a traditional newscast. So there was no guarantee, I think, that if you built it, they would come when it came to changing a newscast. So I think once the ratings started to decline, we went back to a much more traditional newscast. I think it might have been a lot to ask the audience to deal with a new anchor, a female anchor, and by the way, in surveys, I think 13% said they didn't want to watch a female anchor. You know, it was still really the domain of domain of white men. And so to have a new anchor, a different face, and a different format all at once, I think might have been too much. And then some people just didn't like what we were doing. I think the critics, had their knives out because I had had a very successful run at the Today Show, and suddenly I was vulnerable. And I think there's a lot of strange schadenfreude that goes on in our business as well. So I think it was a confluence of reasons that just made it just not work. And that's why we reverted back to a much more traditional newscast. I'm really proud of our newscast. I think the staff here, the producers, the camera crews, the correspondents all do a really good job. But probably if I had known I was coming to anchor a very, very traditional newscast, I might have had second thoughts about taking this job. Because the idea of opening it up and doing interviews and making it more accessible and more relaxed and maybe doing something a bit different, that's what excited me and appealed to me about the job. And the notion that I would be setting a great example for women and really sending a message, I hoped, that a woman could be as good as at this job as any man.
Or better.
I mean, that's for people to judge, not for me to say. But I mean, that really as good. It doesn't even necessarily mean better, but I wanted people to see a female newscaster on the evening news and say, yeah, that's normal. That's not a novelty. This isn't a first. This is acceptable. Women are more than half of the population, and newscasters and on-air reporters, they should look like America. And white men, they're just one part of the country. They don't represent all of us.
So are you comfortable now with where you are?
Yeah, I am. I mean, we definitely had some rough times. I did, doing this, and was definitely hazed and criticized, and with a kind of glee that was really hard to understand, to be honest with you. But I kept my blinders on. I decided I was going to be myopically focused on doing the best job I could. I can't control what the critics say. I can't necessarily change CBS News as an institution. All I could really focus on, which was in my power, was the quality of the work I did. And so that's what I've done. And I'm really proud of the quality of work that I've done and the whole news division. And the evening news, I think, is consistently an excellent broadcast. I would put it up against my competitors and feel really comfortable with what we were doing almost on a nightly basis. Some nights are better than others. Some nights you think, oh, we should have really done that story. But I'm very proud of the broadcast, and I'm very proud of myself for hanging in there and sticking with it.
Well, we are out of time, but I do hope we'll be able to come
Yeah,
back.
yeah, if you need to come back, you can do
I'd
that.
like
That's
to,
fine.
but thank you so much.
Yeah,
It was
yeah, yeah.
really a
No,
pleasure.
it's no problem.